Let's look at the role of the government and the Fair Work Commission within Australia's workplace relations system. So we did look at what the Fair Work Commission is in a previous video, and it's very, very complicated. There's all these acronyms and so forth. So let's just break it down and say, look, if we want to talk about the Fair Work Commission, FWC, which is the government agency responsible for managing Australia's workplace relations system, what does it do? And it does these four things here. And again, there's still a lot of information there. So let's just go through each one at a time. So I think the main thing, the most important thing the Fair Work Commission does is create a minimum safety net for the wages and conditions for all employee contracts. This is called the National Employment Standards, or NES. And what we say is this acts as a safety net to protect all employees, as no contract in Australia can have standards below that. What are we talking about? Let's say you're working casually at McDonald's while you study. And you go, I'm applying for this job, but I'm not in a union. And McDonald's says, our offer to you is, if you want this job, to give you $7 an hour. You're going to have to work 80 hours a week, and you're only going to get 1 week of holidays a year. That is illegal. And you go, that's not fair, I can't live off that. And McDonald's goes, well, too bad, take it or leave it. For every job we have, there's 100 people who apply for it. If you don't want it, we'll find someone else who does. That is not okay. And it's not okay because when you think about it, McDonald's has all the power, and you, as an individual employee, have none. So what we have is, in Australia, that this can't happen because the Fair Work Commission has set 10 national employment standards that act as the minimum conditions for all employees. These include things like, and we'll look at them in class, we don't need to really know these so much, but just things like the minimum wage, which at the time it was 1949, it goes up every year. We'll look at that in class and say, well, what is it now? But whatever the minimum wage is, so at the moment it's $21, $22 around there. Yeah, that is the minimum wage. McDonald's cannot pay less than that. They also can't make an employee work for more than 38 hours per week. That's just the law in Australia. What is that law? It's called the National Employment Standards. Who set that? The Fair Work Commission. And every full-time employee in Australia gets a minimum of 4 weeks annual leave per year. So there's 10 standards, there's just 3. I think they're probably the 3 most important to know as a person and also as a student. They're the 3 that are probably easiest to talk about. But yeah, McDonald's cannot rip off an employee because there's what we call this safety net. So every employee has to get these minimum conditions. So we'll talk about those specifically in 6.3 in our next lesson. But for now, we'll say the Fair Work Commission has set these 10 conditions, minimum safety net conditions, that all in contracts have to have as a bare minimum to protect the interests of workers in Australia. Their second role is to provide assistance to help employees and unions versus employers and employer associations when they are negotiating workplace contracts between the parties and help to resolve any disputes that occur. So let's say we've got the trade union here for the building industry, the CFMEU, negotiating with an employer, Simmons Homes, so they're a builder who hires builders. They're negotiating a new contract. And, the Simmons Homes in this case says, we need a contract that says we can get builders to work on Sundays because otherwise we can't compete. And the union says, well, if you're going to make us work Sundays, our members need double pay, which is $80 an hour, or maybe even more. Simmons Home says, we can't afford this, our best offer is $50 per hour on Sundays, and then the union says, not acceptable, we're not negotiating with you anymore, and we're kind of at an impasse here. How does this get resolved? What if neither party is going to come to the table here? Well, what we've got is a group or a government department called the Fair Work Commission who can hear this dispute and resolve it. So first of all, we can resolve it without going to court. So we have that Fair Work Ombudsman. Again, don't worry about it if you don't want to remember that term. You just say Fair Work Commission. The Fair Work Commission has this role that they can get the parties together to mediate, to act as an impartial mediator to get the parties to discuss and resolve their differences. Or they can conciliate to help the parties reach an agreement without the assistance of the Fair Work Commission. But we don't really need to know conciliation. We're actually going to look at this in a lesson 6.5. But for now, why don't we say, how can we resolve this dispute? Well, the Fair Work Commission can help the two parties resolve it by getting them to communicate. Thirdly, the Fair Work Commission has an office called the Fair Work Ombudsman, which enforces the workplace laws and provides assistance to employees and employers with any queries they might have. When you think about it, they're the contact point that parties can go to when they have a query, a complaint, or a dispute with the other party. So we say, here's the employee, here's the employer, and the employee says, how much should I be getting paid by my employer? And Simmons Homes, as the employer, says, can I ask my employees to work weekends if I pay them more? Is that even legal? Employees might have a question like, my employer refuses to install safety policies to protect me. Simmons Home might say, my employers are making me buy them safety boots. Shouldn't they buy them if they're the ones that want the job? Employees might say, how many weeks notice do I have to give if I want to quit my job? Whereas the employer might go, an employee threatened to go on strike because of the cafeteria food. Can they do this? These are all questions that people want to know answers to. How can you get those answers? You can go to the Fair Work Ombudsman. But again, don't remember the Fair Work Ombudsman. If you just want to go Fair Work Commission, that's fine. All these questions can be answered by going to the Fair Work Commission or Ombudsman. And we don't mean literally going there. You just jump on their website here, and there's all sorts of things you can get information on. So it's a sort of a contact point for both parties here, the employees and the employers, to go to whenever they have a query about workplace relations. And lastly, and we'll look at this in lesson 6.5, if the parties just cannot agree to resolve a dispute, the Fair Work Commission acts as a workplace relations court, just like any other court. Like if you saw a movie on TV and it had a court scene in it, this is a court just like that. They can make legally binding decisions regarding workplace relations disputes between the parties, and they can also issue punishments and fines when a party breaches the law. So let's say the union and the employers, they could have a dispute about many things like wages. Maybe people aren't getting paid the right amounts, or maybe not paid at all. Working hours, maybe there's a dispute about too many reasonable extra hours. Workers are working 40, 50, 60 hours a week, or maybe they're not getting enough work. There could be a dispute about workplace safety. The employer does not provide a safe workplace for employees. Rostered shifts, workers are getting too many, too few, getting rostered on the wrong day, and so on. Annual leave, when can it be taken? And maybe there's just personality conflicts and bullying between employees and management. The point is, these are all potential disputes. Well, who can resolve that? So what we've got is within the Fair Work Commission, we've got a court that can hear these disputes just like any other court case whenever the two parties can't agree. But we just give it a funny name. We say in this case that when they go to court for this, it's called arbitration. And that's the name of the court. We don't need to know that, but it is called the Fair Work Division of the Federal Court of Australia. But all they do is they give rulings so that an employer might have to give wages to an employee that was not paid. Or maybe that an employer has to rehire an employee who was the victim of an unfair dismissal. Or maybe a ruling on the wage rate, or the workplace conditions, or maybe they issue a fine and potential jail terms, etc. But the main takeaway here is that a big role for the Fair Work Commission is to be that court, to arbitrate, that's the important word there, to do arbitration, to resolve any disputes legally between employers and employees.